Rugby has a wide world of stadiums, but which is the biggest on each of the 7 continents? And yes, I'm including that one. But some ground rules first. These are the biggest stadiums where rugby is played regularly, so stadiums like Soldier Field in the USA or Wembley in England don't count. Even though they have hosted rugby games there in the past, there are other stadiums in those countries which rugby is played at more regularly or is more closely associated with. But it's also being somewhat based on vibes. I'm not going to pick a 5,000 seater stadium because more games are played there than a 60,000 seater stadium, for example. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into it. Africa, Ellis Park, South Africa. Ellis Park, or for sponsorship reasons, Emirates Airlines Park, is a rugby stadium located in Johannesburg, South Africa. It famously hosted the 1995 World Cup final, where South Africa won the first of their 4 World Cups, but don't worry, they'll never mention it. In what was their first World Cup they played in, and these famous images from Nelson Mandela in the green and gold of the Springboks from that World Cup too. The stadium was first constructed in 1927 when the Transvaal Rugby Football Union, now Golden Lions Rugby Union, picked out a spot for a new stadium after moving from a site that is now the home of Johannesburg Park Station. The move was forced due to arguments amongst different rugby clubs and the Wanderers Cricket Club's claims to the field. They negotiated for the land with City Councillor J.D. Ellis, and after their success, named the stadium after him. In 1969, the Transvaal Union started looking at building a new stadium on the site, as the current one was no longer meeting modern requirements, and only a short 15 years later was the old stadium knocked down and the iconic stadium we all recognise was erected in its place. It made history in 2005 in becoming the first black-owned stadium in South Africa, after the Golden Lions Rugby Football Union passed the management of the stadium over to a company with 51% black ownership. It has also hosted other major sports events other than rugby, when it hosted 5 group games and 2 knockout matches during the 2010 FIFA World Cup, and multiple test cricket matches in the first half of the 20th century. But its history isn't all positive. In 2001, it witnessed a horrible disaster when 43 fans were crushed to death during a football match between Kaizer Chiefs and Orlando Pirates, and is the biggest sporting accident in South African history. In 2008, the name was changed to Coca-Cola Park for 4 years for gaining its current sponsorship. The sponsorship is shared by the stadium's main occupants, the Emirates Lions, who compete in the URC every season. Another option for the largest stadium in Africa could have been the FNB Stadium, but that's the home of Kaizer Chiefs, no, not those ones, the football team. So I opted for the stadium that rugby is more regularly played in. Oceania, Suncorp Stadium, Australia. Lang Park, or Suncorp Stadium for sponsorship reasons, isn't the biggest stadium to host rugby in Australia. Stadium Australia and the Allianz Stadium are both larger, but hosting 1 or 2 internationals a year wasn't enough for me to count it as regular, so I've gone with the home of the Queensland Reds instead. Lang Park was first built in 1914 and replaced the old Northern Brisbane Cemetery. It was leased by the Queensland Amateur Athletics Association in the 1920s, was the home of multiple different sports including cycling, soccer and athletics. But due to poor financial returns, it was subleased to the Queensland Soccer Council in 1935 before the lease was taken over by Brisbane Rugby League in 1953. The stadium is still occupied by multiple tenants, with the Queensland Reds and Brisbane Roar moving in 2005. In 1950, the Lang Park Police Citizens Youth Club was opened, which held youth activities at the stadium involving boxing, wrestling, gymnastics and basketball, to help lower rising youth delinquency in the area. These still take place to this day. In 1962, the Lang Park Trust was created by an Act of Parliament, which led to the building of the Frank Burke Stand in 1962, the Ron McCoffey Stand in 1975, and the Western Grandstand in 1994. The stadium was heavily redeveloped in the early 2000s into the 52,000-seater stadium we know today. In 2011, the stadium hosted the Super Rugby final, which would see its residents, the Queensland Reds, lift their first and only Super Rugby title, unless you count the Super Rugby AU title that they won in 2021 due to travel restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Suncorp Stadium may be a rugby league stadium at heart, but its role at hosting a 142-year-old rugby union institution in the Queensland Reds, along with the occasional Wallabies match, it most certainly is an important venue in Australian rugby union. Europe. Twickenham Stadium, England. Twickenham, Allianz Stadium, which is a different one to the one in Australia, is the home of England Rugby and hosts around 6 to 8 men's internationals a year, a few women's internationals, and also the Premiership final. There may be other stadiums in Europe which host more rugby, but I don't think anyone would argue with you for calling Twickenham a rugby stadium. The 82,000 seater stadium is the largest purpose-built rugby stadium in the world, and is the second largest stadium in the UK, only behind the home of English football, Wembley Stadium. And the only sport to really be played there is rugby. In the 35 years before the building of Twickenham started in 1907, England didn't have a home and would travel around the country to play games. But after selling out Crystal Palace in games against New Zealand and South Africa, with then record crowds of around 50,000, the RFU invested in a stadium of their own and bought a plot of land in Twickenham in London for £5,500. The first stand was erected in 1908, with the first game being played between Harlequins and Richmond in 1909, before England hosted Wales in January of 1910 for their first match at their new home. In 1938, the Calcutta Cup match in the stadium would make history by being the first ever rugby union match to be shown on television, and to mark the 50th anniversary of the stadium in 1959, a combined team of English and Welsh beat a combined team of Scottish and Irish 26-17. In 1991, the stadium hosted the second ever Rugby World Cup final, and the first to be hosted in the Northern Hemisphere, where Australia beat England 12-6 to lift the William Webb Ellis Cup for the first time. The stadium has gone under massive redevelopments over the years, and is completely unrecognisable today to the stadium that was built in 1908. The first redevelopment was in 1921, when a new stand was built above the North Terrace, and then the East Stand was extended in 1927 to bring the stadium to a capacity of 12,000, where further extensions were added to bring the stadium to 20,000 capacity ground. In the 80s and 90s, massive developments happened, which brought the stadium to a capacity of 75,000, and in 2005 the stadium was once again expanded to its now capacity of 82,000. The stadium is also the home of the World Rugby Museum, where visitors can learn about the history of the entire global game, not just England. South America. Jose Amalfitani Stadium, Argentina. The Jose Amalfitani Stadium is not the biggest stadium that Argentina play home games in. That falls to the Estadio Único Diego Armando Maradona, with a capacity of 53,000. But the Jose Amalfitani Stadium has much closer ties to rugby, and only a slightly lower capacity at just over 49,000. The stadium does not currently host any team, but was the home of ex-Super Rugby finalists the Jaguares before they were disbanded in 2020, and would likely be their home again if they were reformed, like some rumours may be suggesting. Although Argentina play their fixtures in stadiums all across the country, the Jose Amalfitani Stadium is often reserved for big games against teams like the All Blacks. Construction of the Jose Amalfitani Stadium was completed in 1951 and is the home of Vélez Sarsfield, a team in the Argentinian Premier Football Division, and was renamed after one of the club presidents in 1968. A version of the stadium was originally built out of wood in 1943 after Vélez were relegated from the Argentine Premier Division and were kicked out of the ground they were currently renting. But this structure was torn down for the newer structure that started construction in 1947. The stadium was originally built smaller than today and was expanded for the 1978 FIFA World Cup, where it hosted 3 group matches. It was hard to pick a stadium for South America, as it isn't a particularly big rugby continent, so that's why I decided to go for the Jose Amalfitani Stadium, even though there are other stadiums that rugby is played more regularly in, like the Estadio Charrúa, which is the home of Uruguay and Penarol Rugby Club in Super Rugby Americas, but only has a capacity of 14,000, so I chose to go for the stadium that describes itself as the home stadium of Argentinian rugby. North America. Dignity Health Sports Park, USA. There are a lot of options to pick from for large stadiums in North America. The main one that might come to mind is Soldier Field in Chicago, where Ireland famously got their first win over the All Blacks, but rugby is played there very irregularly, so I've opted for a different stadium. But here is where we encounter a problem. If I made this video last year, Choctaw Stadium would be the perfect candidate, a 48,000 seater stadium with a current MLR team, but that is no longer the case, as the Dallas Jackals disbanded at the end of the last MLR season. So in my search, I came across the Dignity Health Sports Park, which is the home of RFCLA, previously Rugby Atlanta, who relocated to Los Angeles after the death of their owner. The stadium was first opened in 2003 as the home of LA Galaxy in the MLS, but has hosted many teams from many different sports, from lacrosse to NFL football. It was originally opened as the Home Depot Centre before being renamed in 2013 to the StubHub Centre and then gaining its current name in 2019. It was only the second stadium in the USA designed specifically for soccer in the MLS era, with Pele attending the opening ceremony for the stadium. The sports complex also includes a velodrome, a tennis stadium, and track and field facilities. The Los Angeles Chargers paid $10 million for renovations in 2017 as part of their temporary tenancy as the SoFi Stadium was being built. They increased the capacity by 1,000 seats and added a concession area with food trucks and toilets. To accommodate the 53-man NFL rosters, the 4 small changing rooms were converted into 2 large ones. But history with rugby didn't start with RFCLA. The stadium hosted the first 3 editions of the USA Sevens before moving to Las Vegas, but returned to the Dignity Health Stadium in 2020 and is set to continue hosting in 2025, and is also set to host Rugby Sevens in the 2028 Olympic Games. The USA Eagles have also played 4 games at the stadium, 3 across 2013 and 2014, and then a Pacific Nations Cup tie against Canada in 2024. Asia, Novier Stadium, Kobe, Japan. Now Asia was a bit difficult because there's a few stadiums in the running that host rugby matches. The National Stadium Singapore has a leg of the Sevens World Series every year, so technically it hosts a shitload of games, but it doesn't host many 15s games. And in Hong Kong, the national team tend to play their games at the Hong Kong Football Club Stadium that only hosts around 2,000 spectators, as opposed to the Hong Kong Stadium which hosts 40,000. The obvious place to look is Japan, but it's also not quite so simple there. A quick look on Wikipedia might make you think that Yokohama Cannon Eagles play at the Nissan Stadium that boasts a capacity of 72,000, the second largest stadium in Japan. Easy, let's just do that one. But looking slightly more deeper, you will see they actually play most of their games at the Nippatsu Mitsuzawa Stadium, which only holds around 15,000. So I've opted to go for the Novier Stadium Kobe. It has a decent capacity of just over 30,000, and the Kobe Steelers play most of their home games there. The stadium completed construction in 2001 to replace the Kobe Central Football Stadium that was built in the same site in 1970. It was built as the previous stadium's capacity of only 13,000 wasn't large enough to be a host venue at the upcoming 2002 FIFA World Cup. So the new stadium was built with an original capacity of 42,000 to meet demand for the World Cup, where it would host 3 matches. The stadium capacity was then reduced to 32,000 shortly after the World Cup finished. The stadium also hosted 4 group matches at the 2019 Rugby World Cup, including the eventual champion South Africa, in a 66-7 hiding of Canada. More like Canada, am I right? He normally cuts by Antarctica. 10-foot thick Antarctic sea ice. Yes, Antarctica hosts a rugby match, or at least it used to. When I first read about this, I was sure it must be some kind of April Fool's joke, but apparently it's not. At the base of a volcano on 10-foot thick Antarctic sea ice, the US scientists at McMurdo Station would play the New Zealand scientists from Scott Base in an annual rugby game. The game stopped happening in 2010, as the USA couldn't field a team that year, and they never continued after. According to some people who took part in the game, they actually potentially stopped due to fear of injury, as it cost tens of thousands of dollars to send someone to Antarctica. If they ended up getting injured in a rugby match, you can imagine some people wouldn't be too happy. The USA team never won any of their 26 matches, and in fact, never even scored a try. You might think that this was just a bit of fun, but it was a big deal. They even had jerseys they would wear while playing, at least in the final game in 2010, and the classic New Zealand pastime of naming sports teams in a similar way to the All Blacks continued, with the New Zealand scientists going by the Ice Blacks for their team name. The USA team would even start training months prior, before they even reached Antarctica, to try and be prepared for the onslaught that was to come. I know this isn't really a sports stadium, but they did have posts, and other scientists and support personnel would come and watch the game, and it's also an interesting story. Also, more rugby matches have probably been played here over the past 30 years than some of the stadiums people are shouting about in the comments. I know I use the word scientists throughout this section, but it's important to note that most of the people in Antarctica aren't scientists. It's people supporting them, like cooks, cleaners, mechanics, etc. These people were also involved in this game. You know what's also a fun fact about Antarctica? Is that there's a hole the size of Ireland, and it's actually won more Rugby World Cup quarterfinals than them. Who'd have thought? and you can learn all about the history of the Rugby World Cup by watching this video right here. Thanks for watching.